And welcome back, everyone. We're talking with Dr. Benjamin Powell, and we're talking about better off stateless in Somalia. So, Ben, before the break, we were talking about the previous administration before the collapse, its collapse in Somalia in the early 1990s. And what sorts of economic policies did that government implement related to its farmland?
Well, they had land nationalization and land redistribution. It was often centered around moving hostile groups around in ways that would enhance the power of the ruling government. And in general, policies towards the rural pastoral sector, whereas extracting wealth from them, about two-thirds of the economy was, two-thirds of the value of their economy was produced in the rural sector, but it was, less than 10% of government spending ever made its way out there. So it was basically resource extraction from the rural to benefit, in particular, around Mogadishu.
I see. So as the government fell in 1991, what was the reason for the fighting that has been documented in the movie like Black Hawk Down, and how long did this kind of fighting continue?
So the initial period, so when people hear the word Somalia, they usually think of the word anarchy, except anarchy not as just a lack of an overarching single government, but anarchy as synonymous with chaos. And there was a bit of chaos in the original period after the government collapsed. So from around 1991 through about 1994-95, the rival clans were at war with each other to try to install themselves as the next government. And it makes perfect sense that they'd fight very hard for this. If you think about Somalia's history, it's been one of always having some sort of predatory state that's going to extract wealth from it, whether it was under colonialism of the British and Italians, or later when they got their own national government. The people existed for the benefit of the ruling elite, not vice versa. So
now these rival warlords, they were actually encouraged to establish their own governments by the U.S. and the UN's presence, were they not?
Yeah, so what happened actually is after the famous Black Hawk Down incident, when the United States and UN withdrew, at that point the prospect of anybody actually becoming the new national government diminished greatly. And as a result, so did the fighting. It didn't all of a sudden become a totally peaceful place. There was certainly still private crime and some violence, but it wasn't at the type of level that you'd categorize it with when it had a civil war going on for those first 5 years. Basically, once the expectation of a new state disappeared, so did most of the large-scale fighting. And since then, every time it's flared up, and it is still flaring up right now, it's always centered around an attempt to install a new government, almost always backed by outside governments that create a Somali government in exile that then goes in and tries to take power.
It would make sense that a lot of violence would be centered around the opportunity to have a monopoly use of force. And that's basically what a government is. It's a monopoly use of force. And so if there's a lot of that available, then I think that would be quite a competitive enterprise to engage in. So you mentioned please comment on that if you wish.
Yeah, I was actually just going to say, so some listeners who are a little bit informed about the region might be thinking, but I've heard that they actually have a government in Somalia right now. So there's actually, but what made me think of it is what you just used as a definition of government. For a number of years now, there have been claims to have a government of Somali land in the north and also Puntland in the northeast coast. But these things, while they claim to be a government, don't have any of the essential features that we would usually categorize something as having a government. They don't do dispute resolution. They aren't the ultimate arbitrator on the use of force. To speak of, they don't really tax. They get a little bit of revenue, but it's about $1 per capita. And they don't provide any sort of public goods to the citizens. As far as I can tell, they exist in name only as a hope of being recognized internationally so that they can qualify for international aid that they can then steal for themselves. So while there's claims to be governments there, when I'm done to talk about later on as we talk about living standards in Somalia and what's changed, I'll talk about the whole country, including those northern regions, because effectively they are stateless even though they claim to have them.
You know, in general, we've had some conversations already on Radio Free Market on stateless activities, most notably a show that we did a little while back with Dr. Tom DiLorenzo on stateless but not lawless in the old American West. And when discussing stateless societies or groups, we really need to make a distinction between various definitions of anarchy. Now, you said that Somalia doesn't fit the common definitions of anarchy. How would you characterize these forms of anarchy, different forms of anarchy, and why doesn't Somalia fit into the various definitions that are most common?
Well, I think as a lot of scholars would use the term, anarchy means lack of a single monopoly government over a given territory. And in that sense, Somalia certainly fits the definition. As it's used in common language, many people equate that with also meaning chaos. And since the Civil War period ended in about 1995, it hasn't been widespread chaos in Somalia. There's been what I'd call governance without government. So there's been rules and order that constrain behavior, a judicial system, a process of punishment that enforces the law. And as a result, that's what provided kind of the bedrock property rights to as this interview goes on. So they do have anarchy in the sense of not a government, but it's not that anything goes kind of traditional Hobbesian anarchy of no rules. There's rules that govern behavior and institutions to enforce them. It's just there's no geographic monopoly on this.
So to summarize what we've been talking about so far, it's relatively peaceful, yet not wildly prosperous, but it's still better off than it was.
So with qualification being that right now there's a battle going on in Mogadishu because the transitional federal government, which was backed by their hated neighbor Ethiopia, came in and tried to take power. As a result, Islamic rebels have gained power, and actually at first the Council of Islamic Courts became a particularly nasty de facto government around Mogadishu, but mostly because they were centered as resistance to this externally imposed government. So there is fighting that continues to go on around Mogadishu, but it's centered around this new government trying to come in. And we can talk about pirates later because, of course, that's going to be in anybody's mind when we talk about it.
Yeah, we'll be getting into
external law and order versus internal.
Right, yeah, that's something we do want to talk about a little bit. I wanted to actually talk more about how the structure of Somalia actually was functioning in this more, quote-unquote, more peaceful way. It seems that the key to Somalia's order was in the customary, traditionally based, clan-based law systems. The idea of a decentralized system of law and order isn't actually unique to Somalia, is it?
No, of course not. In fact, actually, when we look at it, it has a lot in common with early versions even of English common law. So they have a common law system. I'll mispronounce it slightly, Xeer, but I just can't rasp my voice like they do, Xeer. And this common law system combines with what they call a dia payment system. So it's a restitution-based legal system, much like much of common law used to be, meaning there's no crimes against the state. All crimes are essentially torts. So when you do a crime against somebody, there's a penalty that you have to pay them to make them whole. This is true for violent crimes as well as it would be for theft and other things. And it's all specified in the dia payment system of what the customary payment would be if you commit a violation. Now, when someone said...
Please,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, sorry I interrupted you, because this to me is just one of the most fascinating concepts that we are definitely going to be bringing other shows out on restitution versus retribution.
So actually, almost any customary legal system that you see throughout history looks for some version of restitution to victims. What happens when economists talk about a failure, a market failure in law and order, of people not having an incentive to prosecute, when you look at the historical evolution, at least through Great Britain in that, it's increasingly as crimes became crimes against the crown, where the fines went to the king rather than the plaintiff, all of a sudden they found people didn't become plaintiffs as willingly anymore. And as a result, you had a failure in the justice system, and they said, therefore, we need government, police, and courts to enforce this stuff.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Now, one thing you've mentioned that does set Somali customary law apart is its non-coercive nature, this this restitution aspect, in that the law follows the individual, something that we here on Radio Free Market have referred to as the law is king versus the king is law. So, Ben, many of us were educated in public schools and were told that if you don't love your government, you have to leave. How is it that there can be a non-coercive law without respect to geography?
So let's build our way into this for a second, and I apologize if this is a little bit long. Interrupt me if you need to.
Well, I'm going to have to interrupt you in about 1 minute, so get started and we'll just continue after the break. So go ahead.
All right. So basically, your customary law, there's no legislature that dictates what the law will be. Instead, rulings are based off custom. What is custom in the community, in business dealings, in conflicts? And when you have a conflict with another clan member, you would turn to your elder, who is supposed to then make a ruling based on what the custom of the community is. If he violates or deviates from what perceived custom is, people will stop turning him to hear cases, and they will turn to others. So the law evolves, but it has to be bottom-up evolution. So as customs change, they get codified in the law through the decision-making of the clan elders. But the clan elders aren't free to legislate what the decisions are. And once they've made the verdict against you, you're obligated to pay. And if you do not, then you are a part of a social insurance group, basically, based off the paternal lineage of your great-grandfather. And they have to pay for you, and then they can attempt to collect from you or socially sanction you or punish you otherwise.
This is very fascinating. We're going to continue this right after the break, folks, so please stay with us. We're talking with Dr. Benjamin Powell on Stateless in Somalia. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay. Stay with us. We'll be right back.